everyone. My name is Grace Peng, and I'm from the Interagency Modeling and Analysis Group, and we are participating in a series of pre-meeting webinars for our upcoming Integrating Machine Learning with Multiscale Modeling meeting on October 24th and 25th of this year. And so the talk for today is by Dr. Clay Morrison. His research is in machine learning and artificial intelligence, where he designs computer algorithms that learn rich structured representations from unstructured data, such as images, video, and text. These representations can then be used in complex decision making. And so his presentation today is entitled AutoMATES, and about automating model assembly from text equations and software. Please welcome Dr. Clay Morrison.
Great, thank you, Grace. So to give a little bit of background, the particular project I'm going to be presenting here is AutoMATES, which is our effort that is part of the Automating Scientific Knowledge Extraction DARPA program that's being led by Joshua Elliott. And our project actually also has some connections to another DARPA project called World Modelers, where there the goal is to be building technology to be able to do large-scale modeling and composing of models that are about large-scale world systems. And so the part of the connection here is that in those cases, we've got lots and lots of very sophisticated high-fidelity models for modeling things like crop systems, the weather, socioeconomics, et cetera. And the problem is, how do we actually get these things to be integrated together? And what I'll be presenting here is our effort where we're actually doing a kind of information extraction. You can think of it as a kind of machine reading, not only of human-produced text and documentation, but even the computational source code itself, and integrating this into an integrated framework. And specifically for the ASCII program, this slide here shows kind of an overall picture of what the program is aiming at, which is to be developing a vision of what computational modeling and development and evaluation we hope it to be like in the relatively near future, where what we see here are three vertical columns. We've got artifacts, things that humans have produced about scientific knowledge in the form of literature, scientific literature, as well as documentation about scientific concepts. And we also have executable source code, this kind of executable knowledge that's been produced in the form of programs, scientific models. And our goal is to be able to read these things into a universal representation that then facilitates the ability for domain scientists to compose those models, to manipulate those models, and extend them in a way that currently is very difficult to do. And Eric Davis from Galois will be presenting a presentation that will be talking a bit more about the right-hand side here, which will include a interface for visualizing and interacting with these models at a level that is familiar to domain scientists without them having to be professional programmers. And then in this framework, being able to evaluate those models and visualize their behavior and go through the cycle of then model revision. So AutoMATES specifically is trying to address this general problem. There are many detailed expert models encoded in software, and they're described in text, literature. However, the software remains pretty much only understood by the people who really wrote it, and it requires manual curation if you're ever going to integrate that with other models or go in and manipulate it. And the textual descriptions of software are completely separate. You may have some source code documentation, but even that source code documentation is just kind of occurring locally with the source code. It's not actually connected in any deep semantic way. So our goal here is to construct and curate semantically rich representations of scientific models by integrating natural language descriptions and equations from publications and documentation with the software that implements those models. And so what I've got drawn here on the right-hand side is the idea that we're going from source code to this kind of intermediate representation that then enables this ability to do this kind of augmentation, composition, and then evaluation in a uniform framework. So going through the steps here I've got an example of some Fortran source code. And this code is actually a part of a model of a simple susceptible, infected, and recovered SIR model from epidemiology. And what we do is we can extract from this source code what we're calling a grounded function network, which is this intermediate representation that calls out, or it explicitly represents the variables and how they're functionally related. And it's important to note here, this is an abstraction over what was in the source code. The source code includes things like control flow, control structures, other kinds of idioms. But in the grounded function network representation, we have what's called a data flow representation, which really just extracts and isolates how do variables affect each other. And how they affect each other is in terms of these functional relationships, which now have been isolated as these little modular building blocks. In this form now, this representation is one that makes it easy for us to then manipulate the program. Also, it makes it easier to visualize it in a human consumable form. What I'm showing here is not that form. Eric will be showing some examples of that in his presentation. Okay, we also are going to be reading from text documents that include equations. And so in text reading, we identify variables, domain concepts, so that is the descriptions or definitions of those variables are expressed in the text. And also there might be units associated with the variables. And so we have a machine reading technology that's able to extract that. And what I'm picturing here is an example of what it is that the reader is able to extract out of that text. And this is now in a machine consumable form. We also are reading equations, and basically we're taking equations as images and going back and interpreting what, or rather translating them into a structured representation that then makes it possible for us to link these equation terms to terms that showed up in the text. So now it's not just an equation image, but the equational expression has now been grounded to what's been described in the text. And this one becomes then an important linkage to eventually going back and linking with code. So here I have my SIR model extracted in this data flow representation. We can take the domain concepts from text and equations and then link those. So now, and also I should be very clear that this reading is also done on code comments, and those can be linked as well. So now we've got a representation of this data flow, of the data flow model of what the code was computing, and it's linked to domain concepts. Now, it's probably not a surprise that getting a nice, pristine picture of the scientific model is in the form that a human domain scientist cares about from code. That code usually involves a lot of different roles, and not all of them have specifically to do with the model. So one of the things that we're able to do with our framework is identify and extract the model from the other code that may be playing some of these other roles. In particular, in this example, this is part of a representation of the Gillespie SIR model. It's another kind of epidemiological model, which has in it, there's the model that talks about the functional relationships between variables that a scientist cares about, but then there's a solver that is basically going to execute this. So here the idea is that the model expresses, in a sense, how the world's changing, whereas the solver is going to execute that model to produce a simulation, that is, produce a solution that says, here's what happened in a specific situation. And we'd like to separate the model from those other parts of the code. And so doing that analysis, we are actually doing a combination of using the grounding information from linking with text as well as looking at the topology of the data flow, we're able to actually isolate the model and extract that. Once we've got that model isolated, then this becomes something that could be the locus of further analysis or further manipulation. This Griffin representation of this model includes the variables that were grounded. So again, each of these circles here that represent a variable, in this case S, that corresponds to the susceptible population, and we now know that after it's been grounded to the text describing it. We also happen to know, based on the text description, that this is in the units of per capita, individuals. We can then export this representation to other modeling frameworks, and this is the connection, again, with what you will see in the presentation by Eric and what Galois is working on, as well as Georgia Tech Research Institute Semantic Models framework, where they can then do manipulations on this model and extensions. In our framework, we're also doing further analysis based on this kind of wiring diagram of the model. Here's an example that comes from the crop modeling domain. Here are two models that have been analyzed by our system, and we're seeing a sort of simplified version of that Griffin representation, that data flow representation. On the left is the ASCII model, on the right is the evapotranspiration model called Priestley-Taylor. And these are two models that both compute an estimate of evapotranspiration. And in fact, they overlap in some of the variables that they use. And we actually know about that overlap, again, based on grounding and the comments. But otherwise, looking at the code, you wouldn't necessarily know that those overlapped. So what we can do with this, now that we've got this Griffin representation, is we can do a kind of very granular model comparison to actually further analyze how, in fact, do these two models differ in their computational form, such that we can then analyze them, figure out how they overlap, how they differ, and then that's useful for then going on and doing further modeling tasks by a domain modeler. And what I've got represented here is the outcome of doing that overlap comparison. On the left is the Priestley-Taylor, on the right is the ASCII model. The blue nodes are the nodes that were identified as being shared between these two models. The ASCII model includes a whole bunch of other variables that are not part of Priestley-Taylor. And what we care about is the functional relationships between these shared variables if we're interested in finding out, well, how are these models similar? And that's then a stepping stone to understanding, well, how do they differ? And so if we look at all the directed paths between the input blue nodes and the output blue node, we can then figure out how to isolate from the more complex ASCII model just the components that would be overlapping with Priestley-Taylor. And then based on this, we can do things like sensitivity analysis to identify, well, which of those variables really clear to play a role. Very quickly, on the left-hand side, I've got a graph showing the response of the leaf area index as a function of day of year and the temperature max. And the take-home message there is basically there's not much of an impact. So that means that's a relationship we don't need to worry about in those two models. Whereas on the right-hand side, we actually find that those two models vary significantly. So the take-home message here is that this ability to do this kind of analysis of code, linking it to domain concepts, lifting it into this intermediate representation, enables domain scientists now to interact with source code, their computational implementations, in a way that right now is very difficult and labor intensive. And so in summary, our AutoMATES system is doing this integration of model semantics from text equations to software in this uniform framework for analysis. This allows for automatic or semi-automating the linking of software to text discourse context. We also, I showed an example of doing model comparison, which then leads to being able to do sensitivity analysis in this unified framework. And then we can also do a model augmentation and composition, composing it with other models that might take, for example, evapotranspiration as an input into another larger overall model. And this is a new kind of tool for doing a kind of contextualized debugging and model communication. Right now, if a domain scientist has their computational model, they can put the source code available online or pass it through email, but that thing still needs to be hand analyzed. Now in this framework, we can read in several models, start doing this kind of analysis, comparison, and augmentation. So thank you very much. That's the end of this presentation. I've got some links here to the AutoMATES project, as well as several other projects that we have going on that people are interested in seeing more of the things that we have going on that are in this general field of doing kinds of information extraction, model extraction, and analyzing models. Thank you very much.